Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rod Masagian, and I'm a researcher with the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer. I'd like to welcome you all to ONCAT's first virtual labor market panel entitled Nonlinear PSE Pathways and Labor Market Outcomes. We have an exciting hour ahead of us, but first, for those of our guests that may not be familiar with ONCAT, we are a provincial not-for-profit funded by the Ministry of Colleges and Universities with a mandate to improve the credit transfer and articulation system for students who attend publicly funded colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes. As part of our work in the research team and in partnership with our colleagues in funding, we have recently supported the development of research streams which promote the use of novel data linkages to understand more about the student life course, particularly as it applies to pathways, how students move between credentials and institutions, and the outcomes associated with various pathways. We're very fortunate to have an esteemed panel with us this afternoon who bring a wealth of experience using large-scale survey data from Statistics Canada's data environment to address these topics. They will be presenting findings based on recent papers they have completed. Two of the projects were funded by ONCAT. Before I introduce our panelists, I will give you a quick rundown of our itinerary for this afternoon. Our panelists will each present findings from their respective projects, 5 minutes each. Following the presentation, we will have a panel discussion where the panelists will address various questions about their experience working with the various StatsCan datasets, the implications of their findings for student labor market outcomes, as well as discussing what is driving some of the patterns. With the remaining time, we will take questions from you, our audience. So please feel free during the presentations to record your questions and enter them into the Q&A. And afterwards, with the remaining time that we have, my colleague Meryl Barado will organize and read out the questions for our panelists. I'll now introduce our panelists. I'd like to welcome Dr. Brad Seward, who will be presenting on behalf of his research team, his co-authors Elizabeth Dewey and Dr. Elizabeth Dewey and Dr. David Walters. Dr. Seward is an assistant professor at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto and the project director of the research initiative, Education and Skills. Dr. Seward received his PhD in sociology from the University of Guelph and has held positions as a postdoctoral research fellow at Nipissing University, as well as being a senior human resources researcher at the Conference Board of Canada. Dr. Seward will be presenting his project entitled Multi-Credentialed Students in Canada, Employment Earnings and Student Loan Holding. This project uses data from Stats Canada's National Graduate Survey. Our next presenters, Dr. Aimé Ntwari and Eric Fecteau, are Statistics Canada analysts working on projects related to post-secondary education and apprenticeship pathways in the Canada Centre for Education Statistics. They will be presenting findings from their recent report entitled The Impact of Short Duration Credentials After an Undergraduate Degree on Labor Market Outcomes. In this project, they work with PSIS data and link it with tax data found in the T1 family file. And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Xavier Saint-Denis, who will be presenting on behalf of his co-authors, Yacine Bougeja from the University of Montreal and Stephen Sartor from Western University. Dr. Saint-Denis is an assistant professor at the Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique in Montreal, Quebec. Dr. Saint-Denis completed his graduate work at McGill University and worked in the Income Statistics Division at Statistics Canada and as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on socioeconomic inequalities in education and on the labor market. Their project is entitled Nonlinear PSE Pathways and Credential Accumulation. Xavier's team is hoping to continue the work they will be presenting on here today and link the LISA data file with the T1 family file to understand more about how multi-credential pathways are related to family background and income measures. So now I'd like to turn the floor to Dr. Seward, who will present the findings from his paper. Dr. Seward.
Thanks very much, Rod. Sorry about that. Let me just bring this up. Okay, can we see this? Good. Okay, excellent. So I won't go, so I'll be talking today about multi-credentialed graduates in Canada, the employment, earnings, and student loan holding among this group. So we know that the educational landscape is quite evolved and it offers unprecedented choice to students navigating post-secondary education. With this, there's actually a sizable number of graduates that go on to acquire additional education that isn't intended to be a continuation of prior pursuits. We refer to this group in this report as multi-credentialed graduates, but I just want to iterate that it's been discussed a number of different ways over the years. Despite the fact that it's had a number of different terms, however, this really is what we know of this group, the limited amount of literature we have here. And so we wanted to delve deeper on getting to understand this group of graduates. When we talk about multi-credentialed graduates, we're speaking particularly to the pathways between college and university. For this report, we had limited information on postgraduate movement, and so we tended to focus more on college to university pathways, and then compare them to single credentialed graduates, those that get a college, university, or postgraduate only credential. So our motivation for this study is that we need to be able to assess the return to incongruous higher education. What are the costs associated of choosing a new career path? And does the accumulation of additional human capital lead to tangible benefits among multi-credentialed graduates? And do the benefits outweigh the cost? The bottom line here is that understanding these pathways is essential to post-secondary planning. It's particularly useful for those who are unaccustomed to Canadian education, though, for example, those that come from lower SES backgrounds and their parents, or simply just those making the choice to return to education and are weighting foregone opportunity costs, career-specific experience, full-time earnings, the types of things that they have to forego in order to accrue future education. I won't go into a great amount of detail about our data and methods, but we use the National Graduate Survey, which is one of the foremost surveys in Canada looking at the early labor market outcomes of post-secondary graduates. And we combine the 2013 and 2018 waves in order to be able to get a robust enough sample of Ontario grads. And we ended up with a sample of around 8,000 respondents. So the key findings from our study is that at first glance, the story appears to be encouraging. Multi-credential graduates don't appear any worse off or any different than respondents with an undergraduate degree in either their subjective assessments of underemployment or in their student loan holding. Now, there were some exceptions to this, but in the cases where there were exceptions, the explanation was relatively easy to make. It's when we started to look at income that the story became a bit more troubling. MCGs, for the most part, did not differ from bachelor-only graduates in terms of their earnings. Now, we did see very slight earnings bumps, but these were particularly for university to university graduates. And this is a bit of a problematic element in that this group was also those that were most likely to have large loans. And so it was difficult to say whether the cost of additional education is justified. This becomes even more difficult when we start to consider some of the unmeasured impacts of delayed opportunities. So things like time out of the labor market or experience in a particular field, or if the graduate contributions or delaying the purchase of a home. These are all time-sensitive instruments, time-sensitive financial investments that are instrumental to an individual's financial position later in life. And so overall, it isn't easy to make a financial case for multi-credentialing at this point, particularly in comparison to a single bachelor degree. Now, there is the possibility that there are non-financial reasons for why this might be an attractive option. There could be life satisfaction from finding the correct career. There could be better flexibility or work-life balance. There could be geographical drivers that are driving multi-credentialism. But still, on a whole, the trial and error of planning one's educational investments isn't the most efficient way to go about this. And so there are real opportunities to develop program supports. We could do this proactively by supporting strong pathway planning to reduce individual and social inefficiencies. We could also continue to expose students to at different stages of their education career to in-demand careers that address Canada's skills deficits. Retroactively, to deal with to better deal with multi-credentialism is we need alternative upskilling and retooling strategies that don't carry the same time and financial costs of a second pass through of traditional post-secondary education. There are novel opportunities here in the advent of micro-credentials to develop competencies that allow individuals to pivot into new careers. And so whether we're having modular solutions or accelerated tooling programs, there are ways here that we can be more efficient and cost-effective to allow Canadians to find their way in our labor market. Now, this was a very brief overview. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact me at this email or visit our website at futureskillscanada.com.
Thank you, Brad. And hopefully we'll have some time to circle back to some of the points that you made later on. So I'll turn the floor over to MA and Eric. The floor is yours.
Thank you. You can see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So yes, today me and MA and Tori are gonna present about the impact of short duration credentials after an undergraduate degree on the labor market outcomes. First, I just want to mention our commitment to data security. So as part of our mandate, guaranteeing the security and sensitive statistical information within Statistics Canada is a top priority. We deploy state-of-the-art tools and processes to prevent disclosure and ensure the confidentiality and privacy of individual data. And only aggregate non-confidential data are released outside Stats Canada. So I'll just go over a little bit of our population analysis. So first, I want to define short duration credential. This is a program that lasts generally 1 to 2 years full-time, undergraduate certificate, for example, undergraduate diploma, master's certificate, etc. We have two groups of analysis in our paper. The Back Plus group, which is about 5,300 individuals who completed a short duration credential within 6 years after a 2010 bachelor's degree. And then we have the Back group, which is about 70,000 individuals who did not complete any further education after their 2010 bachelor's degree. There are many other pathways, about 30,000 individuals doing traditional and non-traditional pathways that aren't part of these two groups. Here's a little bit of insight on what this population, or how quick they are doing it, doing their short duration credential. As you can see here, for the Back Plus group, the individuals who return to school, about 50% of them return almost immediately after, within 2 years of their undergraduate degree, or complete it within 2 years of their undergraduate degree. Similarly, about 1/3 complete it in the same field of study. This is much more common among healthcare at 86.8%, and much less common among arts and humanities at below 13%. And also there's large outflows. So here in this Sankey diagram, on the left, you can see the undergraduate degree in 2010, and on the right, you can see the short duration credential, and you can see large outflows between social and behavioral sciences and from arts and humanities, both of them towards business and administration. I'll pass it on to Emmy now.
Thank you. Thanks again to ONCAT for this invitation. Yeah, I would like just to start by borrowing this most commonly and differently used terminology of stackable credential, which refers to this image of Lego block and the metaphor of assembly of sequential post-secondary awards to allow individuals to progress on a career path. The question from our article was, do those stackable credentials have a labor market value? The study we are summarizing here showed that there is a return on investment in additional short credential after a bachelor degree. in fact, completing an additional short credential has a relatively strong economic benefits in terms of job quality indicator. In this study, we looked into 4 themes: the percentage of graduates employed in low-skilled services. This refers to retail trades and accommodation and food service, where normally the salaries and other benefits are lower. We looked at the unionization rates before and after earning a second credential, the participation rate in a pension plan, and employment income. All those 4 themes are interrelated, as you may think. Our results show that 2 years after earning a short credential, the proportion of employed in low-skilled trades fell from 22% to 9%, which is a decrease of more than 10%. The unionization rate increased from 37% to 42%, which is 4.6 percentage points comparatively to 2 years before the second short credential. The rate of participation in a pension plan increased from 30% to 46%, which represents more than 16 percentage points compared to 2 years before earning the second short credential. The graduates in the back group, those who earn a second credential after bachelor degree, had a higher growth in employment income when we compare 2 years before and 2 years after earning this short credential, if we compare to those who didn't earn any additional credential. Comparatively by field of study, we see, next slide, we see like in some field of study like science and science technology, healthcare, art and humanities, we see that the back plus group outpassed the back group in terms of earnings, and in most of all other fields, they close the gap in terms of earning. This is a quick summary of the main findings from our article. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, MA and Eric. Xavier, the floor is yours.
Okay, stop me if you can't see my PowerPoint or hear me. Thanks a lot to ONCAT for this invitation. It's a pleasure to present these results today. So basically, this project started from the idea that, or the realization that, PSE, post-secondary education pathways in general are becoming increasingly complex. And the literature that documents these increase in complexity focuses on different dimensions, right? So access to PSE, persistence in PSE, and different dimensions of pathways such as transfers between programs that are not necessarily completed. There's also a focus on labor market outcomes, obviously. But the knowledge gap that we had identified, and I think Brad also covered some of this in his presentation, were that there's a more limited focus on credential accumulation pathways. So what is also called multi-credential pathways. Most of the studies that did focus or do focus on credential accumulation use data that have a short observation period. So we can observe credential accumulation, but only generally, often only over a short duration of time, rather than over the whole life course of adults. Same for labor market outcomes that are often observed shortly after graduation rather than much later in adulthood. And so this has consequences, for example, for our understanding of labor market outcomes among older individuals or individuals who return into PSE much later in life, or much later than their first credential. And so the objective of the project was really to document credential accumulation pathways in Canada, addressing those caveats, and also explore the outcomes associated with them. So for that, we used the data from the longitudinal and international study of adults. And in wave 3, the survey includes a very interesting module that asks respondents to provide information about their first 4 completed PSE credentials. So the first 4 that they ever completed. And so in the sample, you have adults who are between 18 and 65. And so even for older individuals, we have all the credentials they ever obtained. We restrict the sample to respondents aged 35 to 59. So the lower bound of 35 allows us to observe to have respondents who had more than a decade to accumulate credentials and then to enter the labor market. So we can so this gives us a long observation window, and it yields a sample of approximately 4,000 respondents with at least one PSE credential in 2016. And so the first thing that we find is so this graph shows the proportion of Canadians who have obtained at least one credential. So that's the bar in blue, or at least two credentials. That's the other bar here by different ages. So 25% of Canadians by 21 years old have obtained a first PSE credential, but that proportion doubles to 50% by 25 years old. But then it keeps increasing quite steadily all the way until 34 years old. And for the birth cohorts that are not censored, that we observe older, we also see that beyond 34 years old, all the way to 50, this keeps increasing. So a first credential can be obtained quite late in adulthood, relatively speaking. Same for second credentials. So by 25 years old, 11% of Canadians had obtained at least two credentials. That doubled to 23% by 34 years old. And for cohorts that we can observe later, that kept increasing as well. So that's a really important dimension a dimension of PSE pathways, and also a nice feature of our data. Now, the second piece of information I want to present today is the actual pathway. So how do individuals accumulate those credentials? So I reported results for Ontario as well as Canada, but I'll focus on Canada mostly, although the patterns are the same, as you can see. So this reports the proportion of Canadians who follow different pathways, so no high school, and then among those who started below the bachelor's level, so who started with a first credential at the apprenticeship, trades, or college level, what was their second credentials? Did they stop? Did they complete their PSE after their first credential? Or did they complete a second credential below the bachelor's level? Or did they complete a second credential at the bachelor's level or more? Same here for those who started at the bachelor's level or with some form of first professional degree, those who stopped after their first credential, those who obtained a second one below the bachelor's level, those who obtained a second bachelor, and those who went to graduate school. And so the first pattern that emerges is that those who start below the bachelor's level, 66% of them are likely to will complete their PSE after that first credential, and only 33% of them will persist in these pathways here. And so as a share of all Canadians, it's a bit more than 3%. So less than 10% of all of those who started off at the college or apprenticeship level will end up achieving a bachelor's level education. So that's a sign that the mode of entry into PSE seems to have an influence on the pathways or the highest level of education that tends to be achieved later on. So there's some path dependency here. At the bachelor's level, approximately 50% of those who started off at the bachelor's level persist and complete a second credential, most of them at the graduate level. And so very quickly, what can we see in terms of labor market outcomes? So the numbers that are, I'm just going to focus on the first model here. So that's a multivariate regression model. The numbers that are reported here are the employment income premiums in log points, which can be interpreted as percentage increase. So if we compare those who started off below the bachelor's level through any other pathways that involve more than one credential, or that involve a bachelor's credential, we can see that all of the other pathways do have a premium. So obtaining a bachelor's degree compared to obtaining a college degree is associated with a premium, but then accumulating credentials is also associated with a premium, regardless of the other credential, with one exception, which is accumulating two PSE credentials below the bachelor's level. So two apprenticeship certificates or two college certificates or diploma. The other pattern that stands out, and that very much mirrors the findings from the Reese team, is that we don't see a lot of difference between those who complete a single bachelor degree and those who start off at the college level and then go on to obtain a bachelor. So 0.35 versus 0.46. Here, the difference is it's not statistically significant. But it's still slightly larger in terms of size than what we could observe when we use data sets where the observation window is shorter. So it seems like when we observe outcomes later in life, the gap seems to widen, which is not surprising, knowing that we know that people with different levels of education experience different wage growth rates. The other pattern that we're finding is those who start off at the bachelor's level and then obtain a college or apprenticeship certificate after their bachelor experience a smaller premium than those who just complete a single bachelor credential. And that difference here is quite substantial by 20 log points, and it's also statistically significant. And finally, the most rewarded, the PSE pathway associated with the highest employment income premium is the one that involves a bachelor degree followed by a graduate degree. And as we've seen, that pathway seems to be relatively close to those who start off at the college level. And so it's really important to read those findings in complement with the findings from the previous slide on the distribution of PSE pathways. I'll stop here. In terms of discussing the mechanisms and the implication, I think we'll have time to address that in the discussion period. So thank you very much. And my email is here for questions.
Thank you, Xavier. Thanks to everyone. That was really interesting, and hopefully we can pick up on some of the points that were not addressed in the presentation. So we'll move to the panel discussion. I have 3 questions. Hopefully we'll have time, and I'll address the question, and each of the panelists will have 2 minutes to provide their input and address the question. So the first question is that you each use distinctive data sets to address a similar concern. So the influence of multi-credentials on labor market outcomes. What were some of the limitations of the data, and how might you address them for future projects? So Brad, start with you.
Thanks very much, Rod. The first thing that jumps out with the NGS is, well, it's this amazing tool of studying the early labor market outcomes of grads. We are quite limited in some of the sample size constraints around that survey. The big one for us was the field of study indicator. It was difficult to really get it to a granular level of analysis of field of study with that survey, even when we pooled and when we were looking particularly at Ontario. And so we weren't able to see changes in field of study from one credential to the next, which is sort of one of the underlying and important messages for multi-credentialism. The other problematic element of the NGS is that it dropped in 2018, it dropped the full year, whether an individual worked full year, which complicates some of the earnings and employment profiles around sort of getting at that financial information. There's also the last piece that's problematic is it doesn't allow us to capture transfers. So those that completed part way and then moved into a credential, which is an important part of the story of weighing whether transfers are more economically beneficial than finishing a credential and moving on to another one. And as Xavier had mentioned, there's the short time frame of study 3 years out from the NGS. So all that to be said, these are sort of all interrelated and are things that can be solved with using administrative linkages. And when I talk about this, I'm speaking primarily to the Educational and Labor Market Longitudinal Platform, the ELMLP. It contains both administrative post-secondary records and tax data that sort of allow us to circumvent all of these limitations. We can have a much more granular level of analysis with field of study. There's a larger sample of graduates. It would be a larger sample, but something that would allow us to get more in depth on some of these limitations that the NGS had, now that we have an overview understanding of what the experience of multi-credentialism.
Thank you. Same question for Eric and MA about the limitations of the data and how you might address them.
Thanks. I'll start with just a small point, and then I'll pass it on to my colleague. One of the big limits for our analysis was the time series. We looked at the 2010 graduates over 6 years after. We saw massive growth for this population up to a similar level to the bachelor's. What would be interesting and would solve this limit would be to look at it again in 5-10 years with a much longer time series to see how long, if the growth continues or remains the same. I'll pass it on to Emmy.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. The big challenges for this study is when we are using administrative data, because there is this limitation on administrative data because we don't have all explanatory variable who could be put into the model to see the real impact of the second credential. The second, which I can speak briefly, is about the stackable credential framework, because we don't have a good comprehensive understanding of different pathways. And I think this classification of different pathways will need to have also longer series to be able to have a comprehensive framework of all these different pathways, because there is numerous pathways for this post-secondary education. And maybe once the series are longer, we'll be able to have a framework, kind of classification of different cumulative stackable credentials. Thank you.
Again, should I go ahead?
Please.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of the longitudinal and international study of adults, the LISA, so I think the two main limitations are very similar to the ones that we find in the NGS, which are that there's no clear measure of student transfer. So again, the question on PSE history that I mentioned in wave 3 is only about completed credentials. So, so we don't know if individuals completed in between those credentials 1 year or 1 semester in another program, for example. It's also a relatively small sample size, although we're still able to have confidence intervals that were reasonable for our main estimates. So it's when we try to unpack the mechanisms that maybe it becomes a bit more complex. But one thing I want to emphasize is that if we want to start unpacking the mechanisms, and there's some of this in the report that I didn't cover in the presentation, we need to understand some of the aspirations of respondents, some of the background characteristics of respondents, but also some of the events that they experience over their careers. So a job loss is often associated with a return to employment, to education. There may be a career change. It may be a lack of upward mobility in one's firm because the firm is in a declining sector. So there are many reasons why individuals may accumulate more than one credential. And in that regard, I'm not completely sure that the answer can only be administrative data. So I think there's also a lot of potential in survey data that, for example, includes measures of labor supplies, so labor force experience, working full-time, part-time, which is not an administrative data from tax data, for example. Another important dimension is occupations and skill use at work, which are two variables that we have in the LISA and we have in other survey data sources that are really important for understanding of why people may want to return to school. These variables or this information is really hard to get from administrative data. So there are some limitations from survey data that are really important to highlight. But there's great potential in survey data as well, such as the LISA, in terms of understanding how labor market dynamics may interact with education, the dynamics related to education pathways. The last limitation I'd like to flag, it was on the slide, but I didn't mention it, is the analysis, because of sample sizes in part, but also because it has to be conceptualized a bit differently, didn't take into account the PSE pathways of first-generation immigrants who may accumulate credentials, which includes credentials that are obtained abroad. And so these kind of dynamics also are extremely important, but there are challenges, issues, and it's a slightly separate discussion that would require more attention in future research.
Thank you, everyone. The next question: a common thread that weaves through all of your respective projects is that extra schooling beyond the baccalaureate may not pay the labor market dividends that we think. So, for example, multiple credentials can help close the initial gaps, but the two groups make relatively the same, if not more, for baccalaureate holders who stayed in the workforce. What contributes to these patterns? Brad?
Thanks very much. So, I mean, for me, it seems like the issue, or where it seems to come from, is how we value and utilize prior educational attainment. I think part of the issue is that there's no clear way for employers to identify the relevance of competencies in prior education, and particularly prior education that's perceived as unrelated. So how do we translate that experience into something that an individual can leverage? And I think the other side of the communication issue, besides the employer side, is the graduate side of not knowing how to properly articulate or leverage that prior experience as it at the job outset. So in terms of at the candidacy stage, and how to leverage that experience in negotiations, but then throughout the course of the working arrangement, to ensure that they're properly remunerated for that experience. And so I think there's a communication issues on both the issues of skills, competencies, credentials, but then also there's that element of, you know, just the raw time in the labor market in a specific career. And for the multi-credentialed grads, particularly when that second credential is a transition from to an entirely new career stream, that's all lost effort that would have been acquired by those that acquired a single credential and stayed in that career stream. And so part of the explanation there is it's simply just a virtue of the fact of they've lost that time that a single credential holder would have. And I'm sure Xavier could speak to this, but there's a certain rigidity over time that an individual reaches, and they becomes more difficult to acquire higher earnings later in life once that sort of ceiling is reached. And so whether or not a multi-credentialed graduate reaches that or can surmount it, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's where our study needs to go.
Thank you, Brad. The same question for MA and Eric. Would you like me to repeat it? Okay.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
No problem.
I'd like to start just a little bit by talking about the challenge of using administrative data and talk about what was our target population. Our target population in our study was graduates under the age of 25. Since we are trying to control for all unserved variable by choosing the target population, that we were thinking those who got their first graduate degree, just to be able to measure the impact of the second credential. And we still see the gap between those who completed just a short credential and those who just enter right away on the labor market. Some portion are explained by some gender, the initial level of wage, the province, the geography, but we still have some unobserved characteristics. But we believe, like in our sample, all those more than 50% on their second degree just 2 years after the first graduation. And we think more we have longer series. We may see some other pattern. Those who go for further studies after an experience on the labor market, we may be able for targeting another subpopulation, the real impact of the second credential. But we see, compare the group to itself, if we take the group as its control group, we see there was a really good benefit in all job quality indicator, but still catch up at this time. But we expect, like the longer series, we may be this real effect, like the back plus outpassing the back group. Thank you.
And just to add one small point is that we are, as MA mentioned, missing some important information using administrative data. This is where survey data can help complement, and NGS or maybe the census can help here with things like job satisfaction, or other surveys looking at why do people return to school right after or after a little while, because that couldn't be answered using administrative data. That's it. Thank you.
So I guess in terms of the next steps here in this thinking about why we see those outcomes associated with different PSE pathways that are not exactly what we would expect, or that basically after completed reading Eric and Aimé's report, reading Brad's report, and then completing the analysis for my report, the question kind of remains is, how can we understand why some pathways are less rewarded than we would like to or we would expect? And we tried to unpack this a little bit in the report, looking at whether it may be due to the fact that, or maybe driven by the fact that individuals who start off in different fields of study that are differently rewarded on the labor market end up following different pathways. And we had a very basic test for that, but we didn't find that it seemed to be the case so much. So it accounted for part of the differences we observed, but it didn't seem to be the case that most of the differences we saw were driven by differences in the field of study of the first credential. So we looked at job characteristics, but cross-sectionally, so in a very simple way as well. And we didn't see that was driving the differences as well. So using what we could observe in survey data, it was hard to understand the disparities that were emerging. So I think that calls for an investigation, I think, as Brad already pointed out, of how when there's a bifurcation, a redirection, a change in a career change or something like that, how do credentials, the skills and abilities that are acquired through these different programs can complement each other, and how employers perceive that. So I think that's an important part of the question. I think another important and interesting part of the question is to ask what other events may be associated with the decision to return to school and obtain another credential. And in this case, I think we may find out, or at least it's a question that would merit some attention, which is what share of returnees who go on to obtain a second credential do it as a result of a layoff, or do it as a result of a desire to leave an industry that's in decline, as I kind of already mentioned. And if we find that those pathways are associated with events that themselves are already associated with an income shock, a loss of employment income, then we can maybe better understand why, for example, employers will why the earnings of individuals who follow those pathways are not as high as we might expect, because there are events that we're not observing in their careers that are also associated with these credential accumulation pathways. And so again, I think the next among the next steps in this research effort is really investigating the interaction between labor market dynamics and PSE pathways to really understand, what's going on beyond focusing only on the accumulation of credentials. What happens between different PSE spells? What happens during labor market spells between those spells in PSE? I guess I'll stop here.
Thank you. And the last question, the theoretical question, is that each of your reports considers the influence of various theoretical perspectives. So credentialing, human capital, self-selection. So by credentialing, we're talking about degrees as a response to cultural or consumer demands, human capital as a response to technical need or skills in the economy, self-selection, referring to students taking degrees and pathways that are available to them based on interest, skill, and academic achievement. How do you think your findings relate to these different ways of conceptualizing the drivers behind increased educational attainment and outcomes?
It's a great question. I mean, so I have to really look at what the data tells us, and I think the thing that stands out is that among MCGs, there's just the lack of apparent advantage of acquiring additional credentials. We would expect to see that, you know, if we were talking about credentialism or credentialing, these would signal that there are, you know, advantages to multiple credentials, and that there would be clear advantage over single credential holders, even by way of just showing the personal achievement and what those credentials would provide. But that's really not what we're seeing. What we're seeing at those that go on to acquire second credentials have outcomes that match those with single credentials at that level. So it seems to be more a skills-based conversation, or driven more by the skills and competencies within those second credentials that matter more, with education serving as the means by which to acquire those skills. But then we start to think about things like self-selection, and there could be a completely different conversation when we start talking about this. In our own study, we one of the things we ran into is underemployment, and the fact that underemployment objectively, yes, you're going to end up underemployed if you go from a university to a college degree, because college is going to be at a lower level than a university. So logically, they'll be underemployed. But subjectively, when we started getting into subjective assessments, there was actually no difference between underemployment when we considered it subjectively. Graduates did not consider themselves overqualified for the jobs they held, which is an interesting component of this, in that there's a selection into these career paths that sort of go beyond the financial element. But here's where self-selection can become kind of a complicated driver. If individuals lack knowledge about certain career streams, if they don't have the aspirations because of that lack of knowledge to know that there are desirable career trajectories or things along those lines, they'll self-select based on what's in front of them or based on what's in their hemisphere. And so we end up in situations where we end up with a rather expensive trial and error that can happen based on this self-selection into those certain or popular or well-known career streams, and not those ones where we necessarily need people to be going into. And this is inefficient. So if we can try to find a way of addressing this, either through, planned good support through the planning process, or through articulated processes that retool individuals in an efficient way, I think we stand to benefit from this. And I'll probably leave it there.
And I can follow. For us, obviously, it's quite hard to tell the motivation of these students from the administrative data. We didn't use any survey data in this report, so we have to look at what can the administrative data tells us. And there is some patterns that are interesting and might shed some light on why these people are going back to school. The patterns I especially want to talk about is the movement between fields of study or not. We know that about 1/3 of students, only 1/3 of students do their second short duration credential in the same field of study. This is much more common among the healthcare. So healthcare do it again in healthcare, which might point to some selection reasons. But on the other hand, there are lots of outflows, as we saw, between social and behavioral sciences, or from that and from arts and humanities towards business. So there's also a movement there. I'll pass it on to Emmy.
The other things which can be related to this question is also we see from our findings, we see 2/3 of graduates who completed a second graduate did it at a college level. This may contain some information on availability on the specific second credential, on the type of the second credential. And we see most of them did their second credential right after their bachelor degree, which may be related to acquiring new skills as they they are changing also their field of study. This is what the finding which may be related to the 3 point of the question. Thank you.
So the small point I'd like to raise, or maybe formulate differently as an answer to this question, is to think about, first of all, what we mean by self-selection, in a sense that self-selection here, I think, captures the idea that there are some dynamics we're not observing that push certain students to sort into certain pathways versus others. And so I think that this idea that it may be driven by, for example, a change in career aspirations as students discover PSE, especially among, for example, first-generation students, and discover avenues that they weren't aware of before entering PSE. But again, it may be a result of events that happen on the labor market here. And so that's another way to understand that that discussion about the dynamics around selection here, especially seeing that second credentials are often obtained by adults after spending, in some cases, some time on the labor market. I think the other question that's interesting here in terms of theory is that accumulating credentials involves obtaining new skills, developing new skills potentially, but also we know from the signaling literature that a PSE credential sends a signal. So employers are not necessarily aware of all of the skills that individuals who went through PSE do have, but a credential sends a signal. But accumulating credentials, especially when the pathways were kind of non-traditional or non-linear, sends an additional signal, which is not just what's written on the degree, but it's the pathway itself, the pathway through PSE, that is a signal in itself. And I think that was, I guess, Brad's first point about communication. I think one area that we could investigate further is trying to really better understand how different non-traditional pathways are perceived. When we see, for example, somebody who has a bachelor's degree going to college after and completing a college certificate or diploma, is it perceived as somebody who enhanced their skills, or is it perceived as somebody who bifurcated and went in a whole other direction? These different perceptions would be possibly associated with different labor market outcomes. So yeah.
Thank you, Xavier, and thanks to everyone. That was really interesting. I wish we had more time. We're getting close to the end, but I believe we do have at least one question in the Q&A. So I'll just turn it over to my colleague Meryl, and she can read that out.
Perfect. Thanks, Rod. Thanks, everybody. We did have one just general question about access to the slides after today's presentation. So I just wanted to mention that this webinar is recorded and it will be available. We'll be emailing that recording out, and panelists can feel free as well to type in their emails if they would like into the chat, so that if slides are available, they can get in touch. So the question we have is for Dr. Saint-Denis, and it's sort of a two-part question, so maybe the second part we can open that up to the whole panel. Okay, so the question is, can you see if students attend the same college/university that they graduated from when seeking a certificate program? For example, do you see university graduates seeking out certificates at colleges? And the second part of that question is, are there any geographic trends that are emerging to students seeking out certificates like close to home?
Yeah, I can answer some of that, but Eric and Emma may have also something to add to this. So the Lisa questions include some questions about the institution where the credentials were completed, but with a smaller sample size, it's a bit harder to emphasize those patterns. So we started to explore it a little bit, but we ended up not including it in the final report. So unfortunately, here we don't have, and I'm not aware of empirical results that do look at that. So it's a very good question for which I don't have an answer, unfortunately. And then in terms of geographic mobility, so that wasn't included in our report either, but I think there is ongoing work on this topic. So the person who asked the question, I mean, I would invite you to contact me, and I can maybe redirect you to some resources if you're interested in that question.
Thanks, Xavier. Also, a reminder to our attendees that MA and Eric's paper is available, and the other two ONCAT funded studies, Xavier's and Brad's, will be forthcoming shortly. So please keep an eye out on our social media channels for the release of those papers. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. This was really interesting. I personally learned a lot, and I hope you all did as well. And just a reminder that because it's being recorded, for anyone that missed this webinar, we will make it available shortly. So please also keep an eye out for that. So again, thank you. Are there any more questions, Meryl, or?
No, unless other panelists wanted to respond to the geographic. It is a little bit outside of perhaps.
Well, we're close. Yeah, we're kind of close to the end. So okay. Yeah, if anyone wants a last word, go ahead. Otherwise, yeah, this webinar is going to come to an end. Anyone? Yes. A round of applause for all our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
yes,
thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.